Hi there. Thanks for clicking on the video. Super appreciate it. If you might consider supporting the channel, because I'm being vax mandated into oblivion, and this is kind of what I got. So this is going to be, there's going to be a lot of cuts. I'm going to get right to it. It's all pretty much going to be juice. And we're talking about unethical human experimentation in the United States, particularly as it pertains to the United States government and their various organizations. And without saying anything that would violate anybody's terms of service, let's just say that I am government hesitant. And here's why. U.S. Army doctors in the Philippines infected 5 prisoners with bubonic plague and induced beriberi in 29 prisoners. 4 of the test subjects died as a result. There's the classic Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Also referred to as the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. It was a clinical study conducted between 1932 and 1972. That's 40 years. In Tuskegee, Alabama, by the U.S. Public Health Service. In the experiment, 399 impoverished black males who had syphilis were offered treatment by the researchers, who did not tell the test subjects that they had syphilis and did not give them treatment for the disease, but rather just studied them to chart the progress of the disease. By 1947, penicillin had become available as treatment, but those running the study prevented study participants from receiving treatment elsewhere, lying to them about their condition so that they could observe the effects of syphilis on the human body. To see what it do. By the end of the study in 1972, only 74 of the test subjects were alive. 28 of the original 399 men had died of syphilis. 100 were dead of related complications. 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. The study was not shut down until 1972, when its existence was leaked to the press, forcing the researchers to stop in the face of public outcry. Which can only make you wonder, if that didn't happen, how long would they have done this? The answer is as long as they wanted. All right, our next stop on the pain train here is the Stateville Penitentiary malaria study. Was a controlled study of the effects of malaria on the prisoners of Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois, beginning in the 1940s. The study was conducted by the Department of Medicine, now the Pritzker School of Medicine at the University of Chicago, in conjunction with the United States Army and the U.S. State Department. At the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors cited the precedent of the malaria experiments as part of their defense. The study continued at the penitentiary for 29 years. In related studies from 1944 to 1946, Dr. Alf Alving, a nephrologist and professor at the University of Chicago Medical School, purposely infected psychiatric patients at the Illinois State Hospital with malaria so that he could test experimental treatments on them. See, it's bad when Nazi doctors are like, tu quoque oui. In a 1946 to 1948 study in Guatemala, U.S. researchers used prostitutes to infect prison inmates, insane asylum patients, and Guatemalan soldiers with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases to test the effectiveness of penicillin in treating the STDs. They later tried infecting people with, quote, direct inoculations made from syphilis bacteria poured into the men's penises and on forearms and faces that were slightly abraded, or in a few cases through spinal punctures, unquote. Little interjection, I don't think anyone gets syphilis that way. Don't know why you were doing that. Approximately 700 people were infected as part of the study, including orphan children. Whew. The study was sponsored by the Public Health Service, the National Institutes of Health, the Pan American Health Sanitary Bureau, now known as the World Health Organization's Pan American Health Organization, and the Guatemalan government. The team was led by John Charles Cutler, who later participated in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Which begs the question, dude, didn't you know about penicillin? Cutler chose to do the study in Guatemala because he would not have been permitted to do it in the United States. In 2010, when the research was revealed, the U.S. officially apologized to Guatemala for the studies. Well, isn't that nice of us? A lawsuit has been launched against Johns Hopkins University, Bristol Myers Squibb, and the Rockefeller Foundation for alleged involvement in the study. In 1950, to conduct a simulation of a biological warfare attack, the U.S. Navy sprayed large quantities of the bacteria Serratia marsensins, considered harmless at the time, which it isn't, over the city of San Francisco during a project called Operation Sea Spray. That's super worth looking into on its own. Numerous citizens contracted pneumonia-like illnesses and at least one person died as a result. The family of the person who died sued the government for gross negligence, but a federal judge ruled in favor of the government in 1981. Serratia tests were continued until at least 1969. Getting a little MK Ultra in here. In 1953, Dr. Frank Olson and several other colleagues were unknowingly dosed with LSD as part of a CIA experiment, MK Ultra. Olson died 9 days later after falling to his death from a hotel window under suspicious circumstances. Frank Olson's super worth looking into, and my God, did his family have to fight the fucking government to find out what happened to him. From 1963 to 1969, as part of Project Shipboard Hazard and Defense, also known as SHAD, the U.S. Army performed tests which involved spraying several U.S. ships with various biological and chemical warfare agents, while thousands of U.S. military personnel were aboard the ships. The personnel were not notified of the tests and were not given any protective clothing. Chemicals tested on the U.S. military personnel included the nerve gases VX and sarin, toxic chemicals such as zinc cadmium sulfide and sulfur dioxide, and a variety of biological agents. In 1966, the U.S. Army released Bacillus globigil into the tunnels of the New York City subway system as part of a field experiment called A Study of the Vulnerability of Subway Passengers in New York City to Covert Attack with Biological Agents. The Chicago subway system was also subject to a similar experiment by the Army. Oh boy, the human radiation experiments section. There's some real good U.S. government shit in here. So let's start with just the opening synopsis here. Researchers in the United States have performed thousands of human radiation experiments to determine the effects of atomic radiation and radioactive contamination on the human body, generally on people who were poor, sick, or powerless. Most of these tests were performed, funded, or supervised by the United States Military Atomic Energy Commission or various other U.S. federal government agencies. In a 1949 operation called the Green Run, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission released iodine-131 and xenon-133 into the atmosphere near the Hanford site in Washington, it's Washington State, which contaminated a 500,000-acre area containing 3 small towns. In 1953, the AEC ran several studies at the University of Iowa on the health effects of radioactive iodine in newborns and pregnant women. In one study, researchers gave pregnant women between 100 and 200 microcuries of iodine-131. If you're not familiar with how radiation's measured, that's a lot. To study the women's aborted embryos in an attempt to discover at what stage and to what extent radioactive iodine crosses the placental barrier. In another study, they gave 25 newborn babies who were under 36 hours old iodine-131, either by oral administration or through an injection, so that they could measure the amount of iodine in their thyroid glands as iodine would go to that gland. In another AEC study, researchers at the University of Nebraska College of Medicine fed iodine-131 to 28 healthy infants through a gastric tube to test the concentration of iodine in the infants' thyroid glands. Sorry, I stumbled all over that one. In 1953, the AEC sponsored a study to discover if radioactive iodine affected premature babies differently from full-term babies. In the experiment, researchers from Harper Hospital in Detroit orally administered iodine-131 to 65 premature and full-term infants who weighed between 2.1 and 5.5 pounds. I really got to question what that was about. In Alaska, starting in August 1955, the AEC selected a total of 102 Inuit natives and Athapascan Indians who would be used to study the effects of radioactive iodine on thyroid tissue, particularly in cold environments. Over the 2-year span, the test subjects were given doses of iodine-131 and samples of saliva, urine, blood, and thyroid tissue were collected from them. The purpose and risks of the radioactive iodine dosing, along with the collection of body fluid and tissue samples, was not explained to the test subjects, and the AEC did not conduct any follow-up studies to monitor the long-term health effects. In an experiment in the 1960s, over 100 Alaskan citizens were continually exposed to radioactive iodine. In 1962, the Hanford site again released iodine-131, stationing test subjects along its path to record its effect on them. The AC also recruited Hanford volunteers to ingest milk contaminated with iodine-131 during this time. April 10th, 1945 to July 18th, 1947, 18 people were injected with plutonium as part of the Manhattan Project. Doses administered ranged from 95 to 5,900 nanocuries. From 1946 to 1953, at the Walter E. Fernald State School in Massachusetts, in an experiment sponsored by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and the Quaker Oats Corporation, yes, the oatmeal company, 73 mentally disabled children were fed oatmeal containing radioactive calcium and other radioisotopes to track, quote, how nutrients were digested, unquote. The children were not told that they were being fed radioactive chemicals. They were told by hospital staff and researchers that they were joining a science club. You gotta trust the science. University of California Hospital in San Francisco exposed 29 patients, some with rheumatoid arthritis, to total body irradiation of 100 to 300 rad doses to obtain data for the military. In the 1950s, researchers at the Medical College of Virginia performed experiments on severe burn victims, most of them poor and black, without their knowledge or consent, with funding from the Army and in collaboration with the Atomic Energy Commission. In the experiments, the subjects were exposed to additional burning, experimental antibiotic treatment, and injections of radioactive isotopes. The amount of radioactive phosphorus-32 injected into some of the patients, 500 microcuries, was 50 times the acceptable dose for a healthy individual. For people with severe burns, this likely led to significantly increased death rates. Between 1948 and 1954, funded by the federal government, researchers at the Johns Hopkins Hospital inserted radium rods into the noses of 582 Baltimore, Maryland schoolchildren as an alternative to adenoidectomy. Similar experiments were performed on over 7,000 U.S. Army and Navy personnel during World War II. Nasal radium irradiation became a standard medical treatment and was used in over 2.5 million Americans. So, quick side note that's not on here, that I just know from looking into it, is that this was the standard medical treatment. Irradiated radium into people's noses for several years based on this study, until they went back and looked at it and realized that it increased the risk of brain cancer and other cancers by over 50% in those 2.5 million people. So the Atomic Energy Commission funded the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to administer radium-224 and thorium-234 to 20 people between 1961 and 1965. Many were chosen from the Age Center of New England and had volunteered for research projects on aging. In 1957, atmospheric nuclear explosions in Nevada, which were part of Operation Plum Bob, were later determined to have released enough radiation to have caused from 11,000 to 212,000 excess cases of thyroid cancer among U.S. citizens who were exposed to fallout from the explosions, leading to between 1,100 and 21,000 deaths. Between 1960 and 1971, the Department of Defense funded non-consensual whole-body radiation experiments on mostly poor and black cancer patients who were not told what was being done to them. Patients were told that they were receiving a treatment that might cure their cancer. But the Pentagon was trying to determine the effects of high levels of radiation on the human body. One of the doctors involved in the experiments was worried about litigation by the patients. He referred to them only by their initials on the medical reports. He did this so that, in his own words, quote, there will be no means by which the patients can ever connect themselves up with the report, unquote, to prevent, quote, either adverse publicity or litigation, unquote. From 1960 to 1971, Dr. Eugene Sanger, funded by the Defense Atomic Support Agency, performed whole-body radiation experiments on more than 90 poor black advanced stage cancer patients with inoperable tumors at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center during the Cincinnati radiation experiments. He forged consent forms and did not inform the patients of the risks of irradiation. The patients were given 100 or more rads of whole-body radiation, which in many caused intense pain and vomiting. Critics have questioned the medical rationale for this study and contend that the main purpose of the research was to study the acute effects of radiation exposure. From 1942 to 1944, the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service conducted experiments which exposed thousands of U.S. military personnel to mustard gas in order to test the effectiveness of gas masks and protective clothing. Seems like you could have done that with like some air pumps and filters. From 1950 through 1953, the United States Army conducted Operation LAC, Large Area Coverage, spraying chemicals over 6 cities in the United States and Canada to test dispersal patterns of chemical weapons. Army records stated that the chemicals which were sprayed on the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, included zinc cadmium sulfide, which was not thought to be harmful. It is. A 1997 study by the U.S. National Research Council found that it was sprayed at levels so low as not to be harmful. It said that people were normally exposed to higher levels in urban environments. So, what happens when you stack that exposure on the normal exposure? To test whether or not sulfuric acid, which is used in making molasses, was harmful as a food additive, the Louisiana State Board of Health commissioned a study to feed, quote, Negro prisoners, unquote, nothing but molasses for 5 weeks. One report stated that prisoners did not, quote, object to submitting themselves to the test because it would not do them any good, unquote. So at some point, somebody kind of tried to stop some of this stuff because in June 1953, the United States Army formally adopted guidelines regarding the use of human subjects in chemical, biological, and radiological testing and research, where authorization from the Secretary of the Army was now required for all research projects involving human subjects. Under the guidelines, 7 research projects involving chemical weapons and human subjects were submitted by the Chemical Corps for Secretary of the Army approval in August 1953. 1 project involved vesicants, 1 involved phosgene, and 5 were experiments which involved nerve agents. All 7 were approved. The guidelines, however, left a loophole. They did not define what types of experiments and tests required such approval from the Secretary. Operation Top Hat was among the numerous projects not submitted for approval. It was termed a, quote, local field exercise, unquote, by the Army and took place from September 15th to September 19th, 1953, at the Army Chemical School at Fort McClellan, Alabama. The experiments used Chemical Corps personnel to test decontamination methods for biological and chemical weapons, including sulfur mustard and nerve agents. The personnel were deliberately exposed to these contaminants, were not volunteers, and were not informed of the tests. In a 1975 Pentagon Inspector General's report, the military maintained that Operation Top Hat was not subject to the guidelines requiring approval because it was a line-of-duty exercise in the Chemical Corps. From approximately 1951 to 1974, the Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania was the site of extensive dermatological research operations using prisoners as subjects. Led by Dr. Albert M. Kligman of the University of Pennsylvania, the studies were performed on behalf of Dow Chemical Company, the United States Army, and Johnson & Johnson. Dow Chemical wanted to study the health effects of dioxin and other herbicides to discover how they affect human skin, because workers at its chemical plants were developing chloracne, which is what the picture is over here. That looks real sweet. In the study, Kligman applied about the same amount of dioxin as that to which Dow employees were being exposed. In 1980 and 1981, some of the people who were used in the study sued Professor Kligman because they were suffering from a variety of health problems, including lupus and psychological damage. In 1967, the United States Army paid the aforementioned Kligman to apply skin-blistering chemicals to the faces and backs of inmates at Holmesburg. In Kligman's words, quote, to learn how the skin protects itself against chronic assault from toxic chemicals, the so-called hardening process, unquote. In studies running from 1947 to 1953, which were known as Project Chatter, the United States Navy began identifying and testing truth serums, which they hoped could be used during interrogations of Soviet spies. Some of the chemicals tested on human subjects included mescaline and the anticholinergic drug scopolamine. Shortly thereafter, in 1950, the CIA initiated Project Bluebird, later renamed Project Artichoke, whose stated purpose was to develop, quote, the means to control individuals through special interrogation techniques, unquote. Quote, ways to prevent the extraction of information from CIA agents, unquote, and, quote, offensive uses of unconventional techniques such as hypnosis and drugs, unquote. The purpose of the project was outlined in a memo dated January 1952 that stated, quote, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation, unquote. The project studied the use of hypnosis, forced morphine addiction, and subsequent forced withdrawal, and the use of other chemicals, among other methods, to produce amnesia and other vulnerable states in subjects, in order to, quote, perfect techniques for the abstraction of information from individuals, whether willing or not, unquote. Project Bluebird researchers experimented with a wide variety of psychoactive substances, including LSD, heroin, marijuana, cocaine, PCP, mescaline, and ether. Project Bluebird researchers dosed over 7,000 U.S. military personnel with LSD without their knowledge or consent at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Years after these experiments, more than 1,000 of those soldiers suffered from severe illnesses, including depression and epilepsy. Many of them attempted suicide. And if back to MK Ultra, Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke were the predecessors to MK Ultra. In 1952, professional tennis player Harold Blower, maybe I'm saying that right, died when he was injected with a fatal dose of a mescaline derivative at the New York State Psychiatric Institute of Columbia University. The United States Department of Defense, which sponsored the injection, worked in collusion with the Department of Justice and the New York State Attorney General to conceal evidence of its involvement in the experiment for 23 years. Cattell claimed that he did not know what the Army had ordered him to inject into Blower, saying, quote, we didn't know whether it was dog piss or what we were giving him, unquote. MK Ultra. I'm not going to cover MK Ultra. A lot of people know what it is, but you should seriously look into it because, it's not just a classified program. They were doing some really sick shit. Like, don't just know that it was a thing the CIA did. Go look into that. From 1964 to 1968, the United States Army paid $386,486 to Professors Albert Kligman and Herbert W. Copeland to perform experiments with mind-altering drugs on 320 inmates of Holmesburg Prison. The goal of the study was to determine the minimum effective dose of each drug needed to disable 50% of any given population. Kligman and Copeland initially claimed that they were unaware of any long-term health effects the drugs could have on prisoners. However, documents later revealed that this was not the case. So just a quick interjection before I read this long one. Oh my God, it hurts to read this shit. Anyway. Medical professionals gathered and collected data on the CIA's use of torture techniques on detainees during the 21st century War on Terror to refine those techniques and, quote, to provide legal cover for torture, as well as to help justify and shape future procedures and policies, unquote, according to a 2010 report by Physicians for Human Rights. The report stated, quote, research in medical experimentation on detainees was used to measure the effects of large volume waterboarding and adjust the procedure according to the results, unquote. As a result of the waterboarding experiments, doctors recommended adding saline to the water, quote, to prevent putting detainees in a coma or killing them through overingestion of large amounts of plain water, unquote. Sleep deprivation tests were performed on over a dozen prisoners in 48, 96, and 180-hour increments. Doctors also collected data intended to help them judge the emotional and physical effects of the techniques so as to, quote, calibrate the level of pain experienced by detainees during interrogation, unquote, and to determine if using certain types of techniques would increase a subject's, quote, susceptibility to severe pain, unquote. In 2010, the CIA denied the allegations, claiming they never performed any experiments and saying, quote, the report is just wrong, unquote. However, the U.S. government never investigated the claims. Psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen ran a company that was paid $81 million by the CIA that, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA torture, developed the enhanced interrogation techniques used. In November 2014, the American Psychological Association announced that they would hire a lawyer to investigate claims that they were complicit in the development of enhanced interrogation techniques that constituted torture. In 1942, the Harvard University biochemist Edwin Joseph Kahn injected 64 Massachusetts prisoners with cow blood as part of an experiment sponsored by the United States Navy. This one's not the government, but heck, it might as well be. In the 2010s, Facebook breached ethical guidelines by conducting a research experiment to manipulate 700,000 users' emotions without their consent. A secret Atomic Energy Commission document dated April 17, 1947, titled Medical Experiments in Humans, stated, quote, "It is desired that no documents be released which refers to experiments with humans that might have an adverse reaction on public opinion or result in legal suits. Documents covering such fieldwork should be classified secret," unquote. At the same time as that AEC document, the Public Health Service was instructed to tell citizens downwind from bomb tests that the increases in cancers were due to neurosis, and that women with radiation sickness, hair loss, and burned skin were suffering from, quote, housewife syndrome, unquote. So what's my point in all of this? This is the shit we know about. These are the things that have been leaked. All of this information literally comes from either testimony in front of Congress, but more importantly, from leaks. These things get leaked. They get found out. There's examples in here that clearly state that every one of these agencies, every one of these people involved was worried about legal ramifications, which is a pretty solid implication that they knew what they were doing was wrong. And I'm not saying that this stuff definitively goes on today. But what I am saying is that if somebody punched me in the face like 4 or 5 times over the course of a decade or several decades, well, I would assume that the next time I ran into that person, they would probably punch me in the face. And again, I'm not saying that these things are absolutely happening today in different capacities, in different fields. But what I am saying is that I don't trust the government. I don't know when everybody started trusting the government. You know, in my formative years, people didn't trust the government, and people shouldn't trust the government. Because that's the whole point of freedom of speech, is that you can dissent against the government. It's set up that way so that citizens can always be distrustful of the government. And if the government's not doing anything wrong, then the government doesn't have anything to worry about. But I think that we do. Now, obviously, I didn't cover the entire page. Some of the things on the page are things that individuals did. You start looking into those individuals and you start seeing that they had ties to different government organizations and stuff like that. But to be fair, I guess, I just touched on anything that involved U.S. government agencies explicitly. I'm going to throw the link down in the description so you can check the page out yourself. You can read all the resources. But like, for the love of God, look into what our government has done in the past. Look into it. They count on you forgetting. They count on it. And now the end of the video. If you've stuck all the way through, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. Any support I can get is absolutely awesome. Do the whole like, subscribe, comment thing if you want. It helps out. But I guess I'll just wrap it up with some words from the late, great George Carlin. Because God, do we need somebody like that right now. Not that they'd be allowed to, but Like the man said, the owners of this country, the real owners, not even the politicians, the corporations, the powerful elite, they don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care. You're just meat to them. You're just a commodity to be bought and sold and traded. It never ended. Pessimistically, this shit died a couple decades ago. It's all bought and paid for. And like Carlin said, it's a big fucking club. And you ain't in it. We're not in the club.